Hello, historians, and welcome to another Purple Shirt History. Today we'll be talking about the Paper 4 for A-Level, European Option, Europe in the Interwar Years 1919 to 1939. This focuses mostly on the rise of the fascist dictators, such as Mussolini, Franco, and Hitler, and the interwar years being a period of hope and then ultimately despair, which leads to World War II. Please help your fellow history students find this video by hitting the like button and subscribing. By doing this, it pushes the channel up through the algorithm and we can all get better marks come exam time. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I'm sure the person finding this video because of you appreciates it as well. Now, let's get on to the content and see what happened in the interwar years between 1919 and 1939 in Europe. This is Stalin's Russia, 1924 to 1941. The bookends of this theme is the power struggle between Trotsky and Stalin, which Stalin ultimately wins, and the beginning of World War II. So you're going to need to know a lot of very distinct parts of this timeline. He's trying to manipulate people to get into power. Stalin is the ultimate politician in the Machiavellian sense. We'll discuss that. But he gets the reins of power when everybody thought Trotsky was going to be the successor of Lenin. Then we start to see war communism, the 5-year plans, the terror purges, a whole mess of stuff to go over in this particular video. His early life started as Yosef Vissarionovich Djungashvili in Gori, Georgia, ethnic Georgian. Then he becomes a revolutionary, bank robber, kind of a professional criminal, but on behalf of Marxists. And then he works his way up through the ranks in Lenin's Soviet Union after World War I, being very, like I said, Machiavellian. He uses his position as the party secretary to increase his supporters, so giving membership to people that will do favors for him and getting rid of people that would be opposing him. So by the time there's any type of votes, he had the deck stacked in his favor. In his early leadership, he's not the all-powerful totalitarian ruler. He still needs to ally himself with factions within the Bolshevik Party. Until he can outmaneuver everybody, he needs to play the game. But eventually he does and, winds up killing everybody else. 5-year plans, we'll talk about the 5-year plans and what they focused on, and the final form of Stalinism, mainly in the 1930s up until World War II. Why did Stalin gain power from 1924? There are a couple important factors you're going to have to write about. I would say the most significant factor was everyone was afraid of Trotsky, right? Trotsky was in charge of the Red Army. He was really bellicose. He was really confrontational with the other old Bolsheviks, the people that were there from the very beginning. Didn't have a good relationship. He was not a good politician with people like Kamenev, Zinoviev, Bukharin, all those names that you need to know. Trotsky was not a good politician, and Stalin was an excellent politician. He was always positioning himself as the person that is the safer choice, the more middle-of-the-road guy, painting Trotsky as the extremist. And this worked. And eventually, Trotsky was stripped of his command of the Red Army. He had to go into exile, and Stalin's going to kill him in the 30s. That's much later, but just know that the main thing is Trotsky versus Stalin, and Stalin just produces a masterclass of psychological warfare against Trotsky and eventually takes over from the person that Lenin definitely would prefer Trotsky over Stalin. There was actually a will and testament that Lenin dictated to his wife, Krupskaya, and it said specifically, do not let Stalin become leader. Of course, Stalin didn't want this to get out, and he scored a major win by not getting this will and testament publicly released. The other Bolsheviks were also trashed by Lenin, so nobody really wanted this public knowledge. This goes to show you the good luck also that Stalin had in combination with all of his scheming. There were also distinct policy differences between Trotsky and Stalin. Trotsky wanted to keep pushing and spreading communism all over Europe, and this was called permanent revolution. But by 1924, everyone's exhausted. It's been 10 years of strife, constant warfare, civil war, World War I, hunger, disease. There was a huge typhus epidemic in the country, just upheaval of every sort you could think of. And nobody really had the energy to keep pushing communism into Europe in the way that Trotsky wanted. On the other hand, Stalin proposed something called socialism in one country. This was more consolidating the revolution within Russia, taking a breather, at least in the short term, not being as aggressive with other countries and inviting more conflict into the country and more hardship and suffering. This swayed a lot of the Bolsheviks that were on the fence. They also didn't want permanent revolution. They preferred the policy that Stalin was presenting. There are other factors like Stalin's ruthlessness, his single-minded pursuit of power. The resumes of both of them up to 1924 are not comparable. Trotsky did so much more stuff, going back to like 1905 with the Petrograd Soviet, also basically winning the Civil War as the commander of the Red Army. He had a sterling resume, but his politics were clumsy, confrontational. He didn't have allies, really. Everybody was either scared of him or just generally disliked him, where Stalin was using carrots and sticks to build his political base. How was the USSR governed under Stalin? Now I'll make mention of what I think is the defining character trait of this person, and it is extreme insecurity and paranoia. You could look at how Stalin's personality really reinforced itself within all branches of the Soviet Union, from its foreign policy to its economic policy, which we'll talk about next. But his goals and aims are meant to strengthen the country and strengthen his position in the party. Personally, and at the party level, it's blind loyalty. So anybody who he even suspects of having any independent thought will be eliminated, either sent to the Gulag or killed. In terms of the Soviet Union as a whole, Stalin realizes how backwards the Soviet Union is compared to Germany, the United States, Britain, France, etc. So it's his goal to modernize the country as fast as humanly possible. How effective were Stalin's economic policies? In my humble opinion, they were not effective at all, but of course you can say they were extremely effective. Just back it up with evidence and explanation, and you'll get the marks. But let's take a look at what he did briefly. Getting rid of the new economic plan and implementing the 5-year plans. We'll talk about that stuff. There's collectivization, which is a disaster, leads to millions of deaths, starvation, wanton acts of violence all over the Soviet Union. The human toll is tremendous. Industrialization also, the entire amount of effort that was put in for the output was not terribly efficient. We'll talk about inviting in foreign experts, making places like Magnitogorsk, and some other examples of the industrialization. There are some very impressive feats for sure, but on the whole, in my opinion, you don't have to agree with me, obviously. You can say they were awesome. But if you look at everything in its totality, there was a lot of effort and a lot of waste. And finally, how far did society change because of Stalin's regime? We'll look at the impact on different groups of society, on women, families, ethnic groups, especially non-Russian nationalities. The workers, was it really a classless society? Talk about things like the nomenklatura and the people that were attached to Stalin getting their positions and even ratting each other out during the terrors for anti-Stalinist activities because, hey, I really want your office. This was a big issue in the 30s especially, and impact of the cult of personality and propaganda on all of Soviet society. Why did Stalin gain power from 1924? Lenin's legacy and problems of leadership. On the left there is, I believe, the last picture ever taken of Lenin. He's in a wheelchair. He's had a couple strokes. He's about done. His wife there, Krupskaya, is pushing his wheelchair. And he didn't name a successor. He just did this will and testament in which he pretty much trashed everybody. To the bitter end, Lenin, he couldn't physically shake his fist anymore, but through his words and his wife's pen, he was denouncing everybody for not living up to his standards or whatever the case may be. So he doesn't leave the reins over to somebody, and there's going to be a power struggle. Like I said before, if you were comparing resumes, there is no way Stalin would get the job based on past performance. He did control a few different positions that were very underrated and actually were critical in him making this leap to being the supreme dictator of the Soviet Union. As mentioned before, he was just bank robbing and engaging in some criminal activities to raise funds for the communists. After that, he's doing some newspaper work. He becomes commissar for nationalities, and that's his kind of first big position. He has some trouble during the Soviet-Polish War.
He was put in charge of troops there, and that was a defeat. This is something that he's going to wind up killing Tukhachevsky for and during the purges in the 1930s. But after that, we see him become general secretary. And this general secretary position was way more powerful than anybody thought it was because he controlled party membership. He was able to reshape the Communist Party in his image and pack the entire Communist Party with his supporters. This general secretary position is eventually going to make him the leader of the party and get rid of Trotsky, stripping him of his party membership. Stalin's relations with Trotsky and other Soviet leaders, remember, he doesn't have the pedigree. He's not an original Bolshevik, really. He's not one of the core leaders at the beginning. He rises through the ranks by being deferential, by pledging loyalty to Lenin and the party. He really tries to make himself seem as non-threatening as possible, which is insane looking back on how threatening he really was. He was basically projecting onto Trotsky what he really was, calling Trotsky he was going to be a dictator. He was going to cause upheaval in the Soviet Union and all the stuff that Stalin actually did. He said Trotsky was going to do that. It was more of a confession of what he really wanted to do with the Soviet Union, but placing the blame on Trotsky. So he tried to make himself seem the lesser of two evils with Trotsky. And by doing this, by making Trotsky seem like a bloodthirsty monster, was able to convince enough of the older Bolsheviks, the Bukharins, Zinoviev, Kamenev, these guys that you need to know their names. They were able to kind of form a bloc, an anti-Trotsky bloc, and that led to Trotsky's downfall. Stalin's control and manipulation within the party. Stalin is just a political chameleon. He doesn't have any real political convictions. Whatever way the tide is going, that's where he's going to go. So there's the left wing of the party with Kamenev and Zinoviev. He kind of allies with them. And then there's the right wing of the party with Bukharin, and he does a little switcheroo over to there. He's just going where the center of gravity is at that particular time to outmaneuver his enemies. And once he doesn't need them anymore, he eliminates them. I used to have a little chart in class showing the wings, and Stalin is just a line that is waving and curling back and forth. So he controls and manipulates groups to get rid of other people until there's nobody left standing, and then eliminates everybody. How was the USSR governed under Stalin? The first thing he wants to do is really cement himself in power. And I mentioned that in the last slide, talking about how he eliminated everyone that wasn't directly under his thumb. So all of the administration, here's an NKVD officer, secret police, personal loyalty, propaganda, cult of personality, everything that raises up Stalin's profile and increases his political power. That's what he's really concerned about in the early couple of years of his rule. And that leads to building socialism in one country. It was a winning slogan. As said before, the people in the Russian Empire in 1914 to 1917, it was a slaughterhouse for them on the Eastern Front in World War I. Then after that, the Germans, they had the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and there was a huge upheaval. Once the Germans were defeated, there was civil war. Places like Ukraine, the Baltic states, were trying to break away from the Russian Empire. There were famines, there were disease outbreaks like the typhus one I mentioned. It got so bad they even invited the health committee from the League of Nations in to help mitigate the situation, even though they were extremely wary of foreigners. The civil war dragged on for years between the communists and the whites. And by the time Stalin is in power, his primary goal is to solidify the foundations of the Communist Party. People needed a breather from this bedlam that was the past decade in the country. Next, causes and impact of the Great Terror and use of purges and show trials. The name that you're going to need to remember here is Sergei Kirov, Kirov. His death is crucial in starting the Great Terror. I can go on a huge tangent about Sergei Kirov right now, but I'll just let you study him yourself. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds. The purges and terror are all responses to the negative effects of the 5-year plan, especially collectivization. So we'll talk about that in a second, but collectivization was such a human catastrophe. It affected many, many regions of the Soviet Union, but especially in Ukraine, crushing the kulaks. You might remember from my GCSE depth study, if you took it, that the kulaks were the wealthy peasants that got private property and support under Stolypin. They were very efficient, and they were branded as a class enemy by Stalin. and a scapegoat to destroy. These kulaks were eliminated as a class. Liquidated is the word that Stalin used. So the terror was in the countryside, it was in the cities, purges of the military. The main center of power that Stalin was worried about in its ability to overthrow him would be the Red Army. He really wanted to purge the Red Army of all of their generals and admirals and anybody who thought he couldn't trust. This is an interesting thing because Hitler's over in Germany watching Stalin murder all of his best military people and thinking, maybe this will come in handy in 1941. Stalin uses these things called show trials to help legitimize his rule. They're all confessions under duress. There's blood and, teeth all over the papers that are signed confessing to imaginary crimes. I'll put a link of Stephen Kotkin in the description. He's a professor that's been studying Stalin for, I think, his entire adult life or close to it. So it's very interesting to see his views on Stalin. But my view of the show trials was that communism was like a religion. These guys gave their lives to get rid of the Tsar, to install this first communist system, and they weren't going to denounce communism. They had a very zealous attachment to this ideology, and they would rather sacrifice their lives than denounce communism and the form it took under Stalin. Aims and impact of foreign policy. Everything in domestic and foreign policy was meant to strengthen the Soviet Union. Stalin had a mistrust of capitalism and of capitalists, the Western powers, of everyone. But he needed the expertise of the West. So he was willing to trade raw materials and all the riches of the Soviet Union in order to get technical experts from Germany or America. This becomes especially attractive after the Great Depression starts. So people from the Ford Motor Company would go to the Soviet Union and set up a car factory, or French engineers would make some railroads. The chemists from Germany would come and set up factories. People from England would be architects and design things. And all kinds of nationalities, all kinds of professions were meant to come and strengthen the Soviet Union. In the 20s, I would say foreign policy wasn't a big deal. It wasn't at the top of Stalin's agenda. In the 30s, as World War II gets closer and closer, we do see militarization, and the 5-year plans reflect the changing dynamics in Europe. How effective were Stalin's economic policies, his aims for the economy? Like we said, it's all about modernization, taking this economically backwards country and turning it into a superpower. He wanted to catch up to the Western powers. There's a famous quote, I'm sure it's in one of your textbooks. He said something along the lines that if we don't catch up to the Western powers in 10 years, we're finished, meaning that the Soviet Union would be colonized. The 5-year plans, the first one is about heavy industry, trying to industrialize the country, bringing in those experts. The Magnitogorsk case study is very important. So they basically made a city next to this mountain of metal. Magnitogorsk literally means magnetic mountain. There was so much metal in this area, it was affecting the flight path of birds and stuff like that. So it was a planned city, the first of its kind. They set up a grid system, they had streetcars, workers were brought in from all over the country to get metal out of the mountain to make steel for weapons, for infrastructure, and so on. So heavy industry was the first. And the second 5-year plan. The second 5-year plan also included collectivization. Collectivization was a disaster. Food was not only confiscated from areas, people were not allowed to leave those areas, so they were basically being murdered. And it was an engineered famine that left millions of people dead from starvation. The impact of collectivization was people losing a lot of faith in Stalin. Kirov made a speech kind of criticizing him. Once everybody started applauding, Stalin was like, ooh, I don't like this. And he launched the purges and terror. The third 5-year plan is going to be more about communications and stitching the country together. All of this heavy industry in the Donbass, in the Kuzbass, cotton plantations in Uzbekistan, all these massive projects, dams, things like that. Stitching it all together with communication lines, more infrastructure. Things like the Moscow metro system was made. So these are things that you can mention as evidence as to what progress was made under the 5-year plans. The last 5-year plan was in preparation for World War II, and it gets interrupted by the war, and everything is then made for the war effort. How far did society change because of Stalin's regime? Impact of policies towards women and families. Stalin is more of a traditionalist along the lines of the Romanovs. There was a lot of social experimentation in the early Soviet Union under Lenin. Women were able to divorce their husbands that they didn't like or were violent towards them. They were granted more freedoms, the ability to work, the ability to do a lot of things that they didn't really have under the Tsar. All of these things will go away under Stalin, and they're forced into a more traditional role. Impact of policy towards non-Russian nationalities. Even though Stalin is a Georgian, he really uses the Russian ethnicity and Russianness to unify the Soviet Union. So the policy towards non-Russians is pretty severe, restricting language, restricting customs, culture, religions. So there's a large impact on non-Russian nationalities, including Georgians, which he was one. Impact of economic changes on workers. Communism is meant for the worker and the peasant, right? But workers were really meant to toil under Stalin because he felt, again, that paranoia, that urgency to modernize the country or die. Those were pretty stark terms. And he thought there was no room to relax. That would be treason, that would be a betrayal, and the country would be overrun unless they did things immediately. And it didn't matter if the workers had to work 24 hours around the clock, 365 days a year. Impact of propaganda and the personality cult. We see this picture here with all the pictures of Stalin. The Vazd is the supreme ruler, and that was Stalin. The personality cult is extreme. It's really intense. I think it's the most intense out of any of the European dictators. That's just, again, something I think. You can disagree with me. To the point that Stalin is your real father, your biological parents, that's a happy accident. And having children snitch on their parents if they said anything bad about Stalin, the most famous case being Morozov. Acts like this were meant to tear the family apart. Even at that nuclear family level, absolute loyalty to Stalin was a must. There's a couple ways to look at this, but I think the two ways that you can look at it are a continuation of the Tsar through Lenin to Stalin, or you can look at it from the Tsar to Lenin and then Stalin as the kind of red Tsar, returning to more traditional, customary Russian culture. Wrapping up, Stalin was a political creature at the end of the day. He knew the Soviet bureaucracy better than anyone and was able to outmaneuver all of his opponents and then execute them. He came from nothing and wound up on top. It's a terrifying story, to be honest. Next one, No Man, No Problem. You got to understand the continuity and change factor. So that's the historical skill I want you to focus on if you get this theme for Stalin in the dictator questions. How much is it a change, really, from classical Russian despotism that goes all the way back to, I don't know, you want to go back to Ivan the Terrible or somebody like that? And then how much can you say it is part of the new communist ideology, which is Marxist-Leninism, and that type of evolution, if you want to call it that? Have a real think about which side of the fence you're on. The third and most devastating thing is, yes, Russia modernized and made a lot of industrial zones and weapons factories and metros and trains. A lot of that production was wasted. It was worthless. They had to throw everything away and start again. And they threw away millions of lives. So was the human cost worth this rise of superpower? Could all of these deaths been avoided and still have the Soviet Union be as powerful as it was? It's up for you to decide.